Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington-Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington-Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. On July 4th, journalist Jeff Goodell stood on his back porch in Austin, Texas, with a bad feeling in his gut. He was watching a storm roll through.
You know, I live in Texas. We tend to have intense rainfalls. It's not an uncommon thing, but this was particularly intense. This was, I don't like to use this phrase, but I will. It's applicable here, biblical. I mean, it felt, like something else. And I looked at my wife, who was standing with me, and said, this is going to be trouble.
Jeff writes about climate disasters, heat, but also flooding. He's got a book called The Water Will Come. Last week, it did.
There was water everywhere. I mean, water flooding running into the understory of our house, running through our driveway, out the streets. I mean, it was a major event.
By now, you know what Jeff was seeing. The same rainstorm had just blown through the hill country west of Austin. Only there, the consequences were deadly.
Turning now to the deadly catastrophic flooding in central Texas that is leading to desperate searches for survivors tonight. More than 20 children at this hour are missing, and at least 13 people.
CBS News is learning the worst hit areas of the Lone Star State saw 12 inches of rain per hour on July 4th.
Homes swept away after the rising Guadalupe River blasted through Texas hill country in the dark of night.
In the days since, it's been hard not to focus on stories of survival and stories of loss. More than 100 people were killed when the water rushed in. Many of those lost were young girls and women at summer camp. There are stories of people who woke up to water ankle deep inside their own homes. Stories of people trying to swim to safety who got hit by massive pieces of debris, like a floating vehicle. All of which left so many people asking, why? It seems like so many of the people who were lost were young girls from this summer camp, Camp Mystic, which I think makes everything you hear about this flood even more tragic. But it also stands out to me that there had been floods before, like at this camp. There was this known risk, and that sort of doubled the horror for me.
This region is, called Flash Flood Alley for a reason. There is a long history of flash floods in this area. And this particular camp was, in a low-lying spot near where these two rivers come together, particularly vulnerable. And so it brings up a lot of questions about, why this happened and why there wasn't more thinking ahead, why there wasn't, evacuation plans, many things.
Today on the show, was the flooding in Texas preventable? Or is it just our new climate reality? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
The Red Hot Clearance event is on right now at Burlington, and I'm excited for the markdowns. It's all about savings on top of savings throughout the store. This is when I stock up on styles for my closet, home decor, and much more, because there's up to 70% off other retailers' prices on clearance. I mean, I'm going every day because these prices, too hot to miss. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow. Styles and selections may vary by location.
With a Venmo debit card, you can Venmo more than just your friends. You can use your balance in so many ways. You can Venmo everything. Need gas? You can Venmo this. How about snacks? You can Venmo that. Your favorite band's merch? You can Venmo this. Or their next show? You can Venmo that. Visit Venmo.me/debit to learn more.
You can Venmo this, or you can Venmo that. You can Venmo this, or you can Venmo that. You can Venmo.
The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. pursuant to license by MasterCard International Incorporated. Card may be used everywhere MasterCard is accepted. Venmo purchase restrictions apply.
I'm wondering if you can break down exactly what the situation is on the ground in Texas, particularly when it comes to climate change, that may have supercharged the flooding we saw over the July 4th weekend.
Well, one of the central facts of a warming planet is that, a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. That is just physics. As the Earth heats up, especially the oceans, in this case the Gulf, heats up, the more water vaporizes, it goes up into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere becomes more and more like a big sponge. And so when you have these kinds of events, they tend to be much bigger and much more intense. The National Climate Assessment recently calculated that rainfall events in Texas right now carry 20% more water than they did in the 1950s. There's been a number of what are known as climate attribution studies that show that a warmer climate is amplifying the rainfall events, amplifying the strengths of hurricanes, and creating these sort of bigger deluges that we're seeing. And it's not just in Texas, but it's everywhere.
Does the dry earth mean that it's less able to absorb rain, too, when it does fall?
Yeah, but that's not really the problem in the hill country in this particular case. It has more to do with the geology of the terrain where the rain falls. One of the problems with the hill country and why this flood was so intense is that it's on a kind of fault line that the hill country is a sort of fault line that pushes up in Texas. And that's why it's hilly. And it's limestone and granite. There's virtually no topsoil there. Anybody who's been there can tell you. I mean, you kind of dig your toe into the ground and you immediately hit a rock.
So it's like a water slide.
Totally. It's a perfect analogy. It's just like a water slide. I mean, just imagine, pouring a bunch of water out on the sidewalk. It runs off, right? And that's exactly what happens here. And because of the way these canyons are, you get this funneling effect. So you get this torrential downpours that pours down onto a surface that basically doesn't absorb any of it, funnels it from one channel to another until it gets into these sort of larger rivers. So you have this huge amount of water that is being gathered and funneled into these essentially narrow chutes like the Guadalupe River. And that's why you have these intense flash floods.
It seems crazy to me that you would populate that area. Given what you've just said.
Well, no, it's the hill country is incredibly beautiful. I would argue it's an amazing place. I mean, I got married in the hill country because it was so beautiful. I go there all the time. It's a remarkable landscape. It is has a big place in Texas history. It's really a wonderful, beautiful, important place. But it's a place that has new dangers as we get into a more and more extreme climate. And so part of thinking about how to live in places like that is how do we live differently? How do we have warning systems that tell us about the risks of these floods? How do we not locate camps for children in what are known to be flood risk areas? The hill country is not a place to be abandoned, but it's a place that needs to be sort of rethought in how we live there.
In the wake of these floods, people have been trying to figure out who might be to blame for the high death toll. The Trump administration recently cut hundreds of jobs at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the National Weather Service. the very agencies that are responsible for predicting and issuing warnings about extreme weather. So I asked Jeff, did these staff cuts impact what happened over the weekend?
The cutting of that workforce at the National Weather Service and at NOAA is devastating when you think about the future and about what the implications of this will mean for the next event like this and for our, building a better kind of warning system to prevent the kind of death and mayhem that these kind of extreme events happen. And similarly, the dismantling of FEMA, the Emergency Relief Agency. I mean, normally in events like this, the head of FEMA is right out there all the time saying, we are marshaling forces, we're doing this, we're doing that, managing the chaos and the beginning of the recovery efforts. And as of today, there's been no sign of FEMA at this at all. And so I think the dismantling of the sort of both the science and the emergency response system is absolutely an important conversation to have right now. That said, it does look like from the, warning systems that were sent out by the National Weather Service and things in this particular event, they did a pretty good job. They started on Thursday with there's, flood risk coming up. And then those warnings continued through the evening and into the early morning of Friday morning when the flood was really happening. The question is why those alerts weren't listened to, why the local officials didn't take them more seriously, why they weren't, out at that camp knowing that it was a high-risk area and there were, hundreds of little girls there. Why were they not out there, beginning an evacuation of this, knowing what could have been coming? I think those are the kind of questions that are going to be asked now.
I've been listening to your elected officials talk about what happens now, and I was struck by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who went on Fox News, and he didn't really want to talk about what had gone wrong in this case. He wanted to talk about what the state planned to do in the future, which is put up flood alarms.
But had we had sirens along this area, up and down, the same type of sirens that they have in Israel when there's an attack coming, that would have blown very loudly, it's possible that would have saved some of these lives. And
he said he wanted them in place within a year, very quickly, and the state wanted to fund it. I'm curious what you make of that plan.
Well, the first thing I'll say about it is that, the Texas officials and Dan Patrick in particular are very good at kind of not looking back at responsibility. I think one of the things that needs to happen here, first of all, is a real accounting of what happened and what went wrong. Before you can think about exactly what you need to do in the future, you need to understand what happened and where the breaking points were and where the miscommunication was. And, people like Dan Patrick have been responsible for defunding science research. They have been supportive of defunding FEMA. There is a lot of accountability here, I think, that needs to happen before we start thinking about what to do. And as for the, siren analogy, I do think that, the idea of a kind of warning system that is triggered by rising flood levels is not a bad idea. It's certainly an idea worth exploring. And in fact, the Kerr County Executive Board explored exactly that idea several years ago and decided not to fund it because it was too expensive and they didn't want to raise taxes on people. And the state did not step in and say, okay, we will pay for this. Texas is a place that, is not known for, shall we say, proactive funding of this kind of emergency response stuff, especially when it's related to climate.
Yeah. Some other people have raised the issue of crying wolf, like the area is so prone to flooding that if you had a siren go off every time it might flood, it might go off a lot. But it has been really interesting to watch this debate of should we have the sirens?
Yeah, and I think that those are, legitimate questions. And, this idea of how do we best warn people and what is the best kind of system to have is really complex because that is true that if you have too many warnings, people start to ignore them. In fact, a great example of this is in Texas here, we have not just the sort of amber alerts and things that come out on our phones and the weather service alerts, but also we have these things called blue alerts, which are whenever a police officer is in trouble anywhere in the state, we get these blue alerts on our phones. And, I've turned my emergency warning systems off on my phone because I don't want to get woken up in the middle of the night about some police officer in El Paso who's, in trouble in some way. That's not something I need to know at 3 o'clock in the morning. So in a certain way, the Texas officials have really abused this warning system and made people like me just switch it off. And that's a real danger when you think about how to engineer a system that really works and that people really pay attention to.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The spirit of innovation is deeply ingrained in America, and Google is helping Americans innovate in ways both big and small. Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority is using Google AI to create smarter tolling systems and improve traffic flow for Texans. This is a new era of American innovation. Find out more at g.co/American innovation.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Can we widen out a bit? Because you've studied flooding all over the world, and you've traveled and done really excellent reporting here. And it just strikes me that this flood in Texas joins a long list of floods around the world. Like in October, there were flash floods in Spain that killed over 200 people. In 2022, there were floods in Appalachia. And there were floods just recently in Pakistan. Of course, there were those horrible floods just like a year or two back there, too. So what does all this tell you about our changing world and how water will play a role in it?
Well, I think, to really zoom out in the sort of broadest possible way, I think the most important lesson about thinking about living through this age of climate change is that we've built our world for a climate that no longer exists.
What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I mean, we've built our world with the idea that, the temperature in Texas gets to 105 or 106, and then that's how hot it gets in Texas in the middle of summer. And now it's getting, hotter, longer, faster. We've built our drainage systems for the idea that we're going to get, X number of rainstorms a summer, and that this amount of water, whatever the historical averages have been, that's what it's going to be in the future. We build houses on the beach with the notion that this is where high tide goes. And this is, you look back at the high tide measurements, you think, okay, I'm safe, this is fine. The fact is, all these things are changing rapidly now because of climate change. And so the sort of engineering of how we've built our world doesn't reflect those changes.
What does that mean for a place like Kerr County? Does it mean no more camps along the Guadalupe River? Like, does it mean something else?
It means thinking seriously about how to keep people safe in a place with known dangers like that and known escalating dangers. So does that mean having to close down Camp Mystic and move it to the top of a hill? Maybe. Maybe that's the right thing to do. Maybe it means putting in a kind of warning system and a kind of community plan so that when these events are forecast and when they are imminent, something is done about it.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know if there was any plan at all, because I just can't tell from the coverage I've read.
I can't either. And I think that that's a really important question. Because when we think about adaptation, we think about, you mentioned sirens, different kinds of warning systems, emergency alerts and stuff. But it really has to do with the community, right? It has to do with what are the city officials and the county officials there planning? What is the camp itself planning? How are they thinking about these risks of these flooding? Do they understand that these risks are increasing? And this is the way that kind of climate denial and this refusal to talk in serious terms in places like Texas about the escalating risks from climate change are really a problem, because if you don't acknowledge that the risks are growing and getting worse and getting more imminent, then it's very difficult to develop a plan to deal with it.
Yeah. It strikes me that the way this flood occurred and who it impacted seems designed to have some kind of strong statewide response. Many of the victims of this flood were young girls, and they were campers at a camp that, Laura Bush was a counselor at Camp Mystic, right? A local congressman sent his 2 daughters there. These are people with a measure of authority in the state who are deeply connected to this place. And I have mixed emotions about that, because flooding doesn't always impact people with that much power. And I am curious to see whether there's a different kind of response to this flood than others, whether the response to this flood is appropriate or not. I don't know. And I wonder how you're thinking about that.
Well, I think you brought up a great point there, which is that it does have a very sort of high-level awareness on the sort of social and cultural register here. And that is very different than most flood events, which impact people who are much more vulnerable. What kind of reaction that will provoke, I don't know. I mean, you look at things like Uvalde, the terrible shooting that happened in Texas, and that was, it seemed to me, an event that was, designed to provoke some kind of action on gun control and other things, and it really didn't. And being a Texan, you can't sort of overestimate the ability of Texas politicians and officials to kind of look away from some of the hard questions that this event raises. So what really needs to be provoked by this event is a sort of statewide thinking about not just flash floods, but again, about this whole risk of extreme weather events that are really escalating around the world, but particularly in Texas. I've been writing about climate change for 25 years. I moved to Texas, 8 or 9 years ago, and it really is like living in the belly of the beast. I mean, I think there's no state in the country that has all of the threats of extreme weather related to climate change kind of combined in one place the way Texas does. We have, increasing risk of hurricanes. We have wildfires. We have droughts. We have flash floods. We have changes in disease vectors because of warming climate is allowing more mosquitoes carrying various diseases moving up from Central America. I mean, we really are the epicenter of climate impacts in America. And the best response, the most hopeful response that this would provoke would be to be thinking about that, using this as a springboard to say, hey, our world is changing fast and we are not prepared. So what are we going to do?
Jeff, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Jeff Goodell is a writer covering climate change. Check out his book, The Water Will Come: Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World. That's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, Ethan Oberman, and Anna Phillips. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.